We're going to continue with our lectures on the brain with the cerebrum. So we're going to get into a little more about what's happening with what is the largest part of the brain and the most impressive part of the human brain. What separates us from other animals? It's going to be our cerebrum. That's the part of your brain when you think of the idea of thinking, right? The idea of creating, the idea of logic, the idea of consciousness. That all comes from our cerebrum. And like I said, humans have a really large cerebrum. So this is going to be your cerebrum here, the portion that has all the convolutions that we talked about, those gyri and those sulci. So let's talk a little more about it. What is the job of your cerebrum? Well, the cerebrum really has three major functions that you can kind of attribute to the entire thing. But it gets pretty specific when you go to different areas of it. So let's get started. So the first thing that the cerebrum is responsible for is we have what are called the motor areas. And that is what controls your muscles. So this sends impulses to your muscles. And I want to be clear about something. This is the muscles. This is the voluntary muscles. So these are the muscles you control. So you will activate your motor cortex to make your muscles move. So these aren't those reflex actions that I was talking about earlier. The second area of your cerebrum is going to be the sensory area, and that is going to interpret sensory information coming from your somatic sensory receptors. So what is somatic? That's touch. So this is the information coming essentially from your skin, and also there's also receptors deep to your skin. You can feel things in your internal organs. You'll feel pain and things like that. So sensory area, though, is going to be a portion of the cerebrum which is responsible for interpreting sensory information coming in. So motor information is going out. Sensory information is coming in. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the relationship between those two areas. They're right next to each other. One triggers the other, which makes sense. And then finally, the part that is the most interesting part to me, and the part that we understand the least, is what they consider the association area. So this is not motor, this is not sensory. This is pretty much everything else. So this is going to be like your prefrontal cortex, which is going to be that front of your brain, which is that logic center. This is going to be areas that deal with other things, like, for example, we have areas of our cerebrum which deal with vision and things like that. But when you say association area, we're talking about things like analyzing, interpretation, reasoning, memory, problem solving, the things that make us human, really. So let's go a little bit into depth on each one of these areas. So when you look at the human brain, it's actually broken up into lobes. And there's 4 lobes that you can see. And there's actually a 5th lobe that is internal that is still pretty misunderstood in terms of, exactly what its role is. And it's pretty recent that it was discovered. So we'll start talking about that. But basically, we have these sulci, which are the grooves that we talked about in the last lecture. And some of those sulci are a little bit deeper. And they have names, and they are going to divide the cerebrum into 5 distinct areas, which are going to be called lobes. And each one is named for the bone that it is over top. So we did not really get into the skeletal system as much as I normally would this year. But if you know the skulls of the bone, there's a frontal bone, there's the parietal bones, the temporal is going to be where your temples are, and then your occipital bone is on the back of your head. And that is the name. These lobes are named by those bones. So we have our frontal lobe, we have our parietal lobe, the temporal on the side, and the occipital on the back. And then there's a 5th lobe, which is called the insula, and it makes sense it's called the insula because it's internal. It's on the inside of the brain. And it's located somewhere in this area right here, and it's going to be really, this is the lateral sulcus, so it's going to be deep in this area here, and it's actually going to be contained, there's going to be areas of the frontal, the parietal, and the temporal lobes are going to be involved in this. And we'll talk a little bit more about the insula a little later on. But what they've determined at this point is the insula really deals with emotions. It's like an emotional center. But we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. So we're going to focus on the frontal lobe right now in this part of the lecture. So the frontal lobe is a really interesting part of the brain because this is the portion of the brain that contains the motor cortex, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, and it also has the prefrontal cortex. So this is the area, like I said, that's right in the middle of your forehead, really. That is what makes you who you are. This is the area that is responsible for thought, metacognition. And metacognition is the ability to think about what you're thinking. And that is really what they think separates humans from other animals. We don't we're understanding more every day that we might be wrong about this, but for the longest time, we thought that we were the only animals that had this metacognition, the ability to analyze your own thought. Not just am I hungry, but why am I hungry? So that's all in this frontal lobe. And that's called the association area. So the association area of the frontal lobe is going to deal with things like problem solving, planning, like math. That's where math is, right? Interpretation of these large ideas, creativity, analyzing your dreams, thoughts about, what is my future going to be? I'm going to make plans for the future. Other animals don't do that as far as we know. Other animals don't plan ahead. Now, they've done a lot of research, and they actually just had an article that said that cephalopods, these little tiny octopus-looking guys, they actually do have the ability to plan ahead based on some studies they've done. So we're finding more and more that we might not be the only animals that have that ability. It won't be the first time humans thought we were better than everything else, and maybe we're a little bit wrong. But also, we have the motor areas of the frontal lobe. And the motor area is going to be anterior to the central sulcus, and this is going to be what's responsible for your voluntary movement. So this dark band of cortex right here, this is the part of your brain that controls all of your muscles, all of your voluntary muscles. So I want to say hi to my friend. That is coming from this motor cortex right here. And there's one other area I want to focus on in the frontal lobe, and it's called Broca's area. And Broca's area is going to be found in just right here in this area of the frontal lobe, in the association area, just anterior to the motor cortex. So we have our motor cortex here. So just anterior to that is going to be this area called Broca's area. And Broca's area is a really interesting part of the brain. A huge percentage of our brain is dedicated towards language. And I argue that language is really what sets humans apart from other animals. It's not our metacognition, it's not this, it's not that. It's our ability to speak and understand speech. It allows us to communicate in a way that other animals can't. We can tell people what's coming next. We can, write down our history so other people can learn from it. So Broca's area is part of that whole equation. And this part of the brain is responsible for not speech in general, very specifically the muscles involved in speech. We take for granted how hard it is to speak. Sound is being created by air leaving our lungs, right? So we breathe out, and as air passes through our lungs, it goes through our larynx, which is our voice box. And there's little muscles in there that open and close very quickly. And depending on how far apart they are, that's what controls the frequency of your voice. So that's what makes sound, really. But it's not just that. It's also how we move our mouth, right? So I'm talking right now, and as my mouth moves across my lips, like my lips move across my teeth, my tongue is in different parts of my mouth. I know it's gross, I'm sorry. But the way that happens is what creates different letters. So you might know people, or you probably, it happens to a lot of kids. They have to see a speech therapist early in life. My brother did. Because language is not easy. And this is the part of the brain that coordinates all those very intricate movements of your mouth to make sounds, to make words. In a lot of areas, the way they determine how something works is when something goes wrong, they can figure out what's going on there. So there's a condition called Broca's aphasia. And in Broca's aphasia, that is when there's damage to Broca's area. And what happens in patients that have this condition is they can't speak. They can't make words. So they know what they want to say, but the words just can't come out. So I'm going to show you a video, actually, of a young lady who has Broca's aphasia, and you can see how she progresses through speech therapy. But it's unfortunately, it's a common condition that can occur when you have a stroke. So when someone has a stroke, blood gets cut off to a certain area of the brain, and it causes brain damage. And hopefully, in some cases, it's just a short-term situation, and in some cases, it just continues through their lifetime. But Broca's area is the part of the brain that's responsible for making you have the ability to actually make the words you want to say. And we'll talk more about that as we go through. I'm going to finish up in this lecture by talking about the parietal lobe. So the frontal lobe, we just mentioned, is this area that is going to be in the anterior part of the brain. And just posterior to that, we have our parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe is really interesting. There's still a lot of confusion as to exactly everything that this part of the brain does, but it does a lot. So let's go into it a little bit. The first thing I want to point out to you is that there's a band of tissue, of cerebrum, that is right next to, it's just posterior to the motor cortex, and that is called the somatosensory area. So this is the somatosensory cortex. This is all the information that is coming from your skin and your other senses. So that's coming into this sensory area here, and that's interpreting information. So I touch something hot, and that gets interpreted by the somatosensory part of my brain. Somebody tickles, my side or something, that goes to my somatosensory area. Somebody pokes me, that is all information that's going to my somatosensory area, which is going to be just posterior to the central sulcus. And I'm going to show you an image of those motor and somatosensory in a moment. And then finally, we have our association area of the parietal lobe, and that is going to be, it does a lot. But one area we know it does a lot is with understanding language. So again, a huge percentage of our brain is devoted to language. And that is really, like I said, what separates us from other animals. We can learn from our mistakes a lot better because we can communicate them in a way that other animals cannot. So the parietal lobe is really important for understanding speech and using words and, using the appropriate word for the appropriate situation. Like I said, we take for granted how much goes into speech. I have to put these words together in the right way, and I have to know what each word means in that situation. The English language is difficult to learn. We have a lot of words that we use for multiple things, and depending on the way you say it, it's going to have a different meaning, right? So all that information has to come from somewhere, and that's coming from this parietal lobe. And I'm going to finish up with just this one image here, and this is a pretty interesting one. This shows you the motor area and the somatosensory area back to back. So this shows you where they are, right? This is the central sulcus right here. So the motor area is in red, somatosensory area is in yellow. And what you see here is what part of the body is interpreted by what part of the brain. So if you take a look here, this is going to be that lateral sulcus here, which divides the brain into the right and left hemispheres. And you can see by the size of these organs how much of the brain is devoted to that part of the body. So this is the motor cortex, and you can see it makes sense. Think about it. Your hand has a lot of information going out to your hand, but that's because your hand has the ability to move like this, where on the other hand, your leg has a lot less. Your leg can just do this. So there's not a need for as much neurons to control that area. Another area that has a lot of real estate here is going to be your facial expressions and your mouth, because so much of our language is going to be nonverbal. It's going to be, think about how much information we convey with our faces. Our eyes, our eyebrows go up and down. You can tell a lot. If I'm like this, I'm not happy. But if I'm like this, I'm happy. And you can tell that just by looking at my eyebrows. That's because we have all this control of those muscles, and we can make a lot of different faces. And lastly, if you take a look here, this is the somatosensory cortex. So this is the information, and this is the information about the sensory portion. So these are areas of our body that are very sensitive. Our hands are very sensitive, and that's because that's what we use to get a lot of information from the world. We touch things, and they tell us about them. You don't think about it. Lips the same way. We get a lot of information from our lips. That's why people kiss each other. That is a part of the body that has a lot of sensory information. And you can see here, as you go through, these are all the different areas and the information and the part of the brain that gets interpreted by that part of the body. So if somebody touches my forearm, that's going to be interpreted by this small part of my somatosensory cortex. If somebody touches my face, on the other hand, it's going to be a much larger area. Thank you very much.